Welcome back. Today we are talking with Regina Phelps once again. Regina, lots of information with COVID and RSV and flu, and unfortunately having to talk about measles, and new variants that just keep coming out.
Right.
But let's see if we can move on to something else.
Wouldn't that be great? Well, this is only going to be a slight variation on something else, right? So what I want to do is I had done quite a bit of research for a speech I just gave in Toronto that has some really interesting information, and I would really like to share that with our listeners. And this is basically on the societal impacts of a pandemic. So I've actually done pandemic planning since 1997, and I never, frankly, this is how embarrassing I can't really believe I never thought about this, but I never really thought about, well, what happens afterwards? What happens to society? What happens to all of us? And it just never dawned on me, to be honest. And so I just did a speech for the Continuity and Resilience conference in Toronto, and I was on essentially the long tail of COVID. And what I want to talk about, because I think it has a huge impact, not only on us personally, but also, frankly, on our profession, to understand what we need to plan for and expect over the next few years. And actually, the thing that I found most fascinating is these societal impacts have historically lasted somewhere around 50 years. That's 50 years. That's pretty amazing, right? It's not a short-term thing. Yeah. Oof. So I always ask people, as I have sort of one question for you, and that's really this, and what I would say is that, is this over yet? And I'm really talking about COVID. And really, there's two ways to answer that question. First of all is the medical answer. And the answer is no, the pandemic is not over. I know everybody thinks it's over, but it's not. And this just gives you a visual view of actually all of the variants that we've had, ones that have historically now passed, but ones that are coming up in the future. And it's a very, very busy chart. And the reason I like it is because it shows you how many things are going on. If you look at this particular chart and you look at the very top left-hand corner, you'll see BA1, that was the original strain. And how quickly, a year after its immersion, we came into BA2. And then we actually now have a large list of variants. And now we are in the lower right-hand corner. And now you'll see where we're actually at BQ 1.1 and so on. So medically, it is not over. Medically, it is still affecting thousands of people across countries. It's still, as I mentioned earlier, killing people in the United States to the tune of 330 people a day. So it's not over. But there's another way to look at how you determine whether the pandemic is over or not, and that's the public. This is actually Oktoberfest this year. And as you can see in the mind of many folks, it is over. And that really is true. And you and I have talked about this a lot. Mm-hmm. But Oktoberfest this year was jam-packed, and it resulted in being a huge super spreader event in Germany, with hospitals filling up, ICUs filling up. But, it doesn't really matter. People are over it. And that's something that we have to think about as planners and as individuals, not only living our own individual lives, but what's happening around society. So, and just as we talked about a moment ago, looking at RSV and the flu, people are now wondering, like, oh my gosh, maybe I should be a little bit more careful. And now I think the reason that that's impacting people, as we talked about, is because the audience of who's actually suffering has changed. Where now you're seeing younger kids, babies even, who are suffering from these respiratory illnesses. But for the most part, that's why people don't want to use the M word, mandate, why they don't want to require things, is that the public is done with this pandemic, which, by the way, historically is what happens. In the 1918 flu, the greatest death toll was actually in 1920, when we were over it psychologically, but not medically. And that was the highest death toll worldwide, which I always thought was pretty fascinating.
Which we would kind of be in now, right?
Yes, exactly right. We are exactly in that space where everybody's given up, right? So this gets down to what I call the long tail of COVID, and really what I want to talk about, and we'll probably only get to the center circle today, which is really pandemic societal disruptions. And there is a lot to talk about here, but there's also other things that I will emphasize probably in December, and that is the health impacts, mental health, long COVID, and the impact of the healthcare system. And you just mentioned it briefly when you talked about the fact that our healthcare system is overwhelmed. They've been overwhelmed for 3 years, and they're getting no relief, and people are leaving their profession. So the impact of health is not just you personally or your family, it's a system that's being impacted. There's also education and income losses, and I'll talk about this next month. We're already seeing large impacts to young kids with loss of educational knowledge, but that has the potential for long-term income loss, and I'll share that next month. The future of work, and this is really what I want to talk about in relationship to our work as professionals and what this means for us. And then lastly, the issue of the impact to our profession overall. So that's kind of holistically looking at the long tail of COVID. But what I want to peel back now is actually these societal disruptions. And I want to start with a quote that I think is really important to reflect on. And this is from an historian who wrote extensively about the 1918 flu. And essentially what he talked about, this guy's name is William Rosen. And this is something to reflect on because this is where we are. The effects of epidemics / pandemics are not measured only in mortality, obviously people dying. Their secondary consequences have a much more far-reaching and disorganizing aspect than anything that could have been resulted from the mere reduction of population. So what he's saying, and I think is chilling, is that the secondary consequence, the impact to our society, is far greater than all of the people that have died. And that's really what I want to talk about today, and we'll talk about also next month. Kind of a chilling quote, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Right.
Oh,
yeah. When you think we're over, the answer is we're not over. Yeah. And now we're going to really continue to experience these societal disruptions. So to that, I want to talk about this concept of societal disruptions. This is not a term that I've made up. It's actually a very common study in the field of sociology and also in history, looking at events. So many things that have caused societal disruptions have been things like wars, significant wars. So World War I, World War II, certainly things like a global pandemic have caused major disruption in our society. And essentially that term simply means that we actually have serious disruptions to what's going on in the functioning of society. And certainly in COVID, oh my gosh, we certainly have had that. And then on top of that, the impacts of the war in Ukraine, which has impacted supply chains and many, many, many other issues globally.
Including food.
Including food, absolutely,
Yeah.
which will very likely drive a famine in Africa that they're starting to experience now. And so essentially these societal disruptions really talk about the alteration, the dysfunction, and the breakdown of social life. So, whether that's people acting poorly, we've certainly seen a lot of that in the United States since the pandemic began, but also this issue of how we as a society are really struggling in the lack of our social skills and even the ability to have a conversation with other people. For a lot of people, it's really been difficult. And what this has really caused is really a radical transformation in our society, and everything that we used to depend on, all of those certainties that we always could rely on, aren't necessarily there anymore. Those things have fallen away. And now what's emerging is something quite different. And it's, the rise of, the autocratic government, the rise of poor behavior, the rise of crime, all of those things have really been tied back to this pandemic. And the question really is, this ever happened before? And this is what my study of the last few months and reading, 15 historical books on global events, is that unfortunately, Alex, it's happened after every major pandemic, of which there's been 30 that have been documented well, going back to 430 BCE with Athens. The one that's heavily studied, of course, is the Black Death, which, of course, is the 14th century. That's the Bubonic Plague that decimated Europe. And essentially, there was a historian that wrote about this extensively. And I use this quote because it's chilling, and it says kind of, it could get worse, I suppose, but certainly it gives you an idea that we've been here before. And his quote out of his book is, European society after the 14th century plague was high-strung, on edge, and quick to violence. So fierce and clamorous was life that it could endure the mingled odor of blood and roses. That's pretty telling, isn't it?
Bring some very graphic images, to mind. That's
Yeah,
wow.
yeah, and I have to say that we have certainly seen that in the United States. We've had a rise of all kinds of things going on in the last 3 years. Anything from crime, really poor behavior, the rise of autocrats, the rise of racism, increasingly picking on individuals, anti-Semitism. It's been bad, and it hasn't just been here; it's been globally.
Yep.
Which
Happening up
really,
here too.
yeah, unfortunate,
Yep.
is it? Which really gets to these 5 historical themes, and this is probably all we're going to chance to get a go through. So I want to talk through these really quickly, and we're going to dig more deeply into them. But these are the things that have been historically seen. I'm not kidding, Alex, going back to 430 AD. The first one, and you'll find as I talk through, and all of our listeners, kind of tick in your mind, have I been seeing this in my country? First of all, distrust of government and public health measures. Sound familiar?
Yes, it does.
Yes. An increase of suspicion of government, distrusting anything that's been told you by the government, pushing back against mandates. And you might say, well, has that happened in my country? Well, yes, here in the United States a lot. And then I just point to Canada with the Freedom Convoy that you experienced in Ottawa. The defiance of any kind of efforts to slow the spread, not wearing masking, not wanting to distance, pushing back against closures of businesses, schools, etc. The resistance to mask wearing, by the way, is not a new phenomenon. It goes all the way back to the 16th century when those were really introduced, when people began to understand the bits about microbiology, that indeed you could pass illnesses by breathing, coughing, etc. Masks became used at that point. But of course, when there were plagues and outbreaks, people resisted them. And then vaccine resistance actually goes back to 1770 with smallpox, interestingly enough. And that's when they first started very primitive forms of smallpox vaccines. They would take a little bit of a smallpox pustule and they would mix it with water and they would scratch it on somebody's arm. And what it often did is it caused them to actually have a small outbreak of smallpox, but did not kill them. And they had immunity, and they used that within armies to actually vaccinate soldiers. So it goes back a long way. The second thing is blame. Blame. We're always blaming somebody else. We're blaming others. So that's either by sex or religion or ethnic group. We have been big blamers in the world of how countries have responded overall to outbreaks. It's had Chinese anti-Semites go back way beyond this current outbreak that we had here. And that's, again, a constant theme going back to almost the 14th century. And another one was an excuse for anti-Semitism, blaming the Jewish population for somehow causing this outbreak. You saw that here in the United States, and you're seeing this also around the world. So blame. It's not my fault, it's somebody else's, and we're going to persecute them, is a big issue. The third, and this is certainly what we've seen in the US, and we'll talk at length about this hopefully in our next time, and we may have a moment to talk about it here, the fraying of society. Widespread crime. We've had outbreaks of crime across the United States. Organized crime, small individual crimes, shoplifting, breaking into people's homes, stealing cars, you name it. It's all been material theft, if you will, not so much violent crimes. Political losses. So, elections that have been lost because of the handling of that particular outbreak. So, for example, Trump lost after the 2020 election. Bolsonaro lost just in Brazil. Political losses because people are blaming the leaders that were in charge. There's also been a huge movement towards populism and autocratic governments in many countries around the world. We have seen this in the US, you've seen it in South America, you've seen it in Africa, places in Europe, Italy's new prime minister, Hungary's prime minister as well, autocratic leadership, and you certainly see it in China with Xi and his way of he's been managing COVID, which is a whole thing we could talk about in an entire podcast. The last two I want to mention, and then I'd like to just have a moment to talk before we end today and see what you're thinking about. The next one is conspiracy theories and apocalyptic theories as well. This is not new. Conspiracy theories go back literally to the 14th century, documented in historical text, where people have made up these stories about how things have either been treated, how they started, who's at fault, and also apocalyptic thinkings, where religious leaders saying, "Oh, the end is nigh, and the day of judgment is behind us if you don't repent." That goes back centuries. Not just, I've seen this a lot in the last 3 years, but it's not just to this particular pandemic. And
I've read about that one too, by the way.
Have you?
Yeah, it's in different books, not about pandemic, but it's a way of creating fear to gain control over
Yes,
things.
exactly right.
And then that links into the one that you just mentioned about the authoritarian and autocratic and things like that.
Yeah. And then the last one, which is also kind of interesting, is the rise of the worker. If you look at going back to hundreds and hundreds of years, when there has been pandemics, there has been the ability for workers to organize and to take more control of their life because of the shortage of workers, the impact on workplaces. And so here in the United States, we've had a huge increase in union organizing, strikes that have gone back to the beginning of the pandemic. And so there has been this rise of the worker, which is in many ways a positive outcome, but still something that actually is tied to a common theme in pandemics. So I mentioned those 5 things. We're going to dig into them a lot when we're together next week. But my comment to you, or my question to you, is that when you're looking at your nation in Canada and you look at the 5 things that I just mentioned, do you see common themes based on these historical references to Canada?
Yes. And we only have 3 minutes left, by the way.
I know.
So I'll be really quick in answering. But yes, in some ways to different degrees in what's happening, south of us down in the US. Mm-hmm. But yes, some of that is occurring here. Mm-hmm. The last one, the strikes, we've had the teachers and administrative staff threatening to go on strike here in the province of Ontario a couple of times now. Mm-hmm. And it's happening in some other industries now as well, where people have had enough. We're hearing about it in Starbucks wanting to start unions with the coffee chains now, which weren't there before. So yes, we're seeing all of that going, and the rise of separatism, because, well, we didn't like how that province managed it, so let's get somebody else in power who will tell us what we want to hear, which usually ends up being authoritarian. So yes, all that stuff is starting to happen here. And you mentioned European examples, examples around the globe. So yeah, it's happening everywhere.
This is actually important for us to know and understand, not only personally, within our families and our society, but also for us as a profession, which is really what I want to talk about next month, is to really peel this back more, because these long-term impacts, frankly, will probably last longer than you and I are going to be alive, my friend, which is hard to fathom. But when I did this historical survey and read all of these books, what I discovered is that this goes on. This doesn't go away when COVID finally disappears. It's never going to disappear when it becomes endemic. It will have a long time to unravel the impacts, because especially in the area of autocratic leadership, that is only going to intensify. And we're already seeing that in many places around the world. And we're certainly seeing it in the US with different state governments. And so what I want our listeners to be thinking about before we meet again at the end of the month is that, how is this going to impact us as a profession? And how is it going to impact you personally? Is that we need to think about, we can't be passive, if you will, in how we go forward. And so I think the more that we can understand historical impacts, tie them back to ourselves, it will help us in our planning. And certainly when we have crises, because those will continue, of course, and the impact is going to be potentially more difficult to manage based on these impacts from the pandemic that will be the biggest hangover we've had.
And on that, we've come to the end of the show, Regina. On that happy
note. Is that the bunnies and rainbows end that we were looking for?
I think the bunnies and rainbows left the house.
I'm out of here, right?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Well, I know I'm looking forward to chatting next month. And, it's only a few weeks away when we chat again, but I'm looking forward to chatting about that and sharing the societal impacts because, I think we've only just begun to see change.
Right.
I think a lot more is still to come yet. So,
Yes.
so
And just so people know that we'll be talking about all of this, but in particular, we'll be talking about the future of work and tying that back to what we do for a living.
yes. So thank you, Regina, for sharing all of that with us. I look forward to next month's chat, and hopefully there'll be some good news next month.
I hope so. Maybe we'll have a few bunnies and rainbows, and I'll have to find some to put on a slide if nothing else, right?
Something good.
Yeah.
Thanks, Regina.
You're welcome.
And everybody watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody. If you like that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.